conversation with Katrina Ingram. Did I say that right? Ingram?
Ingram, yes.
Ingram, awesome. From Ethically Aligned AI. So Katrina, thanks for coming into Hazardscape and having this conversation of what I hope will be just the first of many.
Well,
Really
thanks so much
appreciate it.
thanks for inviting me here.
Yeah, you're welcome. And so to start, you are based in Alberta, Canada, right?
Yes.
Okay. I want to make sure people get the geographical reference too, because it's kind of just nice to know that. For me, it's nice to know that there's this kind of work that you're doing is going on, like in Alberta. It's very local to me. It's local to a lot of the people that are going to be watching this. And it's also kind of nice for people outside of Alberta or Canada to know that I think Canada and Alberta are leading some of this technology.
We certainly are. I mean, that's one of the things that I'm really proud of. So I'm actually based here in Edmonton, Alberta,
Okay.
and Edmonton is one of three elite places in Canada. Has one of three elite AI institutes in Canada, and it's a fascinating history of how that came to be. And it goes back to the 1960s when the U of A got one of the first computers in Canada. So you can imagine
Oh,
these massive mainframe computers. And it was one of the first places to get that. And then kind of out of that spun off this kind of subgroup that started doing a lot of work in AI in the 1980s, and then was able to attract a lot of really, really talented researchers here to Alberta. So it's
yeah.
great to point that out, because it's not I wouldn't say it's the most obvious place that you would think of
No.
where this kind of work is being done, but we're a leader globally.
Yeah, because I mean, the world knows us as agriculture, oil, those two main things, hockey now. But yeah, the technology piece and kind of the prairies is not, the glamour story of the times, but I think it's getting there.
Yeah, I think we're hoping to change that. We're having this conversation during the very first AI week in Alberta. So this is being
Oh,
hosted by Amy, and so it's really apropos, I think, that we're having this conversation on this week and talking about AI and just letting
yeah.
people know that we are leaders.
So is that AI week in Alberta or AI week nationally?
It's
Do
AI
you
Week
know?
in Alberta, and
Okay.
next week is actually AI Week in Canada. So we have a
Oh,
national AI Week that we've had for, I believe it's the 35th year that we're celebrating it nationally. But here in Alberta, it's year one. So it's pretty exciting.
hey, that's awesome. Um, okay, so let's get into a little bit about you first, and and ethically aligned AI is your organization, and I'll bring up the website in a little bit. But I wanted to kind of just paint a picture for what you do in artificial intelligence, and what maybe even how you got into it, because I want to debunk this idea that you have to be like a PhD computer scientist to get in and work in AI, because that's not accurate. And I also want to debunk the idea that people need to be concerned about AI in terms of it sort of having this takeover effect of the world. So let's start with, how did you get into AI and your background?
Yeah, absolutely. So you're absolutely right, Brad. Like I love telling the story because I am not a data scientist, and I may be one of the least likely people that you would think would be working in AI. So my background is interesting in that I come out of more of the marketing space, more of a business background, and I spent the bulk of my career in media. So I worked in community radio for many, many years, running a station called CKUA, which for those of us in Alberta, that might ring a
Yeah.
bell. And I loved it. It was fantastic work, loved the people, loved the atmosphere. But after a decade of being there, I decided, it's time to try some new things, not really sure what those things are going to be. And so in midlife, I found myself going back to school. So I was at the U of A doing a degree in communications and technology. And as I was saying, we're a world leader in AI research. So I ran into some people kind of accidentally. I kind of walked into this lecture that was being given by an AI researcher, and he was talking about all of these problems and challenges with AI gone wrong, all of these unintended
Mm,
consequences, things that he was seeing that really concerned him. And I went up to him afterwards and I said, "Who is doing work in this area?" And he told me, "Not enough people." And that really kind of captured my attention, and kind of became the focus of my research, this whole area of AI ethics. So this was 2018. We were just starting to hear about some of these unintended issues in AI, bias, discrimination, and so forth. So I started looking into it, did some research around the area of ethical codes, because at that point, everybody was trying to get an ethical code and put together
mm,
committees and that sort of thing. So I started there. And then I quickly went from that very high level, let's get an ethical code, to how do we actually make this stuff work in companies? How do we help organizations and people make better choices? And then the focus of my research shifted to the applied ethics piece, and really wanting to understand how do we weave this into our development process. So I was doing that work. I graduated in 2020 from my program. I looked around to see who's doing this work in the world. I really want to get back to working with companies and organizations. And honestly, I didn't really see very many people working in this space. And so that really prompted me to launch my own company. So I
nice.
launched my business in 2021. It feels a lot longer. As I'm saying this is like last year, but it
Yeah,
feels a
it's
lot
only been a
longer than
year.
that.
Yeah.
And so we've been kind of pioneering the way and figuring it out. And one of the first pieces of work that we did is building Canada's first AI ethics micro-credential. So I've been working with Athabasca University to provide training to organizations to show them that there are responsible AI strategies that they can incorporate into the way that they're doing things. And so that's kind of been a journey over the last year. And now I'm, working with clients to implement some of these strategies. So again, not a data scientist, but
No.
someone who has kind of done the research, done the work in this area, and is now really wanting to work with industries to help them do better.
Yeah, that is really cool that really you just kind of fell into that lecture, um, decided to talk to the lecturer, and just from that conversation kind of led you into kind of uncovering this area of opportunity that you're able to take advantage of. And it sounds like you're really kind of like you're getting a good response from it. Because yeah, there are some horror stories out there about companies using artificial intelligence, and it creates a lot of issues around discrimination. So can you give us an example of what that would look like in terms of, let's say, because we're talking about disaster risk reduction, emergency management. In that world, reducing disaster risk means reducing disaster risk for all of society. It's got to be inclusive. It's got to be diverse. So there's a lot of opportunity for AI to really, create some really bad outputs that are not within, that are not inclusive, that's going to discriminate, that could harm, that could kill people if the wrong type of decision is made or the wrong output is created. So can you give us an example of a company, or you don't have to say the company name, it doesn't matter, but where they went wrong and what that looks like for people?
Absolutely. So I'll start with the probably the most controversial example, and that is facial recognition
Mm-hmm.
technology. So something to know about AI is it doesn't sit isolated, and I would say this is true of all technologies. We sometimes think, oh, technology, it's over here, and society is over here. No, this is all together. And these technologies exist in bigger systems. So that's something I try and explain to people. And we can think about facial recognition technology. There's an AI component, but there's also hardware pieces like cameras, for example. And if you look at the history of the camera, there's been some problems historically with how cameras see people of color, for example. So you take a technology like facial recognition that's been proven by researchers not to work as well on people of color, and in particular women of color. And there's a famous researcher named Joy Buolamwini who did a lot of her own research on this area. And her research study was called Gender Shades. And she demonstrated through her research how some of these facial recognition technologies were so much more inaccurate when it came to women of color. And her story became the subject of a film called Coded Bias, which is now on Netflix. It's a fantastic film that really goes into a lot of detail about her story, but also the bigger story of how bias and discrimination can become part of AI systems. So you have this facial recognition technology. People are excited to deploy it and use it. One of the use cases is law enforcement. So you think about the policing that needs to happen, and law enforcement sees this technology and goes, this is going to make our lives easier. It's going to be more efficient. We can do more with our limited budgets. All good things that, being fiscally responsible and so forth. However, when you take a technology like that, and if you haven't done your due diligence and you apply it, you can actually be harming communities. And in particular, communities of color have been over-policed, or in some cases not recognized properly. So you can see all the different kinds of ways that this can go wrong. So that's a pretty controversial technology. Now, within that sphere is a company called Clearview AI, and I will mention them because they've gotten a lot of press and headlines. So I'm not really, saying anything out of turn here. But the way in which they got their training data was also controversial. So what they did is they went out to the internet and they scraped all of these pictures of people from different social media platforms, all of these things that where we post our images, and we don't necessarily think someone's going to take these images and then use them for an AI system that's going to be used in policing. We don't think that when we're posting our family photos online, but that's exactly what Clearview did. And then it built this massive database of billions of people. And it now takes that technology and works with law enforcement agencies. And here in Canada, the privacy commissioners did a report where they found that Clearview was offside when it came to certain privacy legislation. And so Clearview has stopped doing business in Canada, but it continues to do business around the world. And most recently, in Ukraine, where it's offered the services of its technology for free. Again, very controversial. So you can see that this kind of one technology, which is an AI-enabled technology, can have all kinds of issues with it through its historical connections to data and how certain groups have been over-policed, and then also how it's applied, again, harming some of the more vulnerable communities. So that's just one famous example.
Yeah, and I also heard there was an insurance company that used AI, and I'm not 100%. I don't know if you're familiar with this story. Are you familiar with it?
I know that, is it Lemonade that you're thinking of, the all AI insurance company?
No, I don't think
No,
so, but
okay.
what is that one?
So Lemonade is even controversial within the world of insurance, where AI is being used, and it's an all autonomous AI enabled insurance company. So it's
Okay.
taken the people out of the mix. And it's fairly new. It's only, I think, in the US. I don't think it's here in Canada. But even within the world of insurance, it's a very controversial company, let's say.
So are they creating, like, are they using AI to predict the risk of somebody based on the information that they have about the person or that the person gives them?
I believe so. Yeah, they're using AI throughout the entire sphere. So traditionally in an insurance company, you might have actuaries whose job it
Yeah.
is to predict risk. And obviously they might be using tools that are enabled with AI, but there's a bit of a human in the loop kind of an element. Lemonade seeks to take the human out of the loop, which is why again, within insurance companies, even it's a controversial
Yeah.
company. So.
Well, that even kind of goes against, I think, from what I understand, because I took the sort of the first course through Amy, the introduction, I think, for strategic executive making, something like that. But they talked a little bit about how, and we'll get into this a little bit more. And I do want to say, so I don't freak you out, when you're talking, I'm going to switch views to just the speaker view so I get your full picture, so people aren't always just staring at me too when you're talking. So don't let that you're not getting cut off. But there has to not with all AI, but with insurance particularly, there has to be some level of human interface. So if the insurance AI is saying, okay, Sally Johnson, we predict that her risk level is this, there should be at least a human looking at that and validating what the AI is doing. Would that, like, that's my understanding, is that kind of human interface, it's recommended that there still be some sort of human decision making in there. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, I'm not going to pretend I know exactly how I've never worked in insurance, and I won't pretend to know exactly what
Right.
happens. But I will say this. So let me just kind of take your example and make it a little bit more general. So all of us use different kinds of tools in our job, and what we're going to see is that more and more of these tools that we use are going to have some amount of AI enabled power behind them, or some amount of machine learning behind them. So right now, for example, we're all familiar with business intelligence dashboards and reporting, and we can take historical data and we can get some data points and we can take that information in and bring it to a meeting and make some decisions with it. We all know how that works because we've been exposed to that world for the better part of 20, 25 years now. So what we're seeing now is this next layer where AI is then going to say, okay, so we've got all this information, we've crunched the numbers, and also this is what we think probabilistically is going to happen. So modern AI is done through statistics, machine learning. It's very good at pattern matching, and it makes probability type predictions. So that information then is taken to the table, and hopefully there are humans that can then be part of that decision-making process and decide, does that sound reasonable or not reasonable? However, in some cases, if you go into a fully automated system, maybe the AI gets to make some level of decision on its own. So you have an autonomous decision being made by the system. And so there is sort of this sense that as these systems become more and more capable, let's say, we rely on them more and more, at what point do we make them more and more autonomous? So you kind of see where this is going, or where this is heading.
Yeah, and so yeah, that's a good segue into giving just a basic understanding of like how AI works. So can you walk us through, just as in very layman's terms, like, what is an AI doing? How is it learning? How is it, performing in from a kind of a technology sense?
Yeah, absolutely. So let me start. Let me just kind of do a little bit of a historical
Sure.
setup, and I'll get to how it works today. So back in the early days of AI, so we're talking 1950s, 1960s. What people were trying to do at that point is they were trying to create rules-based systems, and they were basically trying to say, okay, in any given situation, what do I need to tell the computer so it can make some decisions? And they found that this was very, very complicated. They understood that very quickly how complex this was. And I'll give you just a small example. So there's a book by Stuart Russell called Human Compatible, and he uses this example of a roller skate race. So some kids are going to have a roller skate race. Should they do it on grass, or should they do it on gravel? And he lists a whole bunch of different options. And so the person who is looking at this might go, well, probably pavement or cement is the best option for this roller skate race. But the reason we know that is because as humans, we have all this context. We know what roller skates are. We know, that you put them on your feet. We know that, these surfaces are smooth or not smooth. And so all of those kinds of things would need to be trained or explained into a symbolic AI system. So they found that this was really hard slogging. It wasn't really kind of panning out the way that they hoped it would. And so fast forward to 2012, where we have a different way of building AI systems. And it's based on machine learning. And essentially what happened during that time between the 1950s, 1960s, and 2012 is that we got lots more data in the world. So the internet gave us this opportunity to kind of have all this data collected in the world in a digital format. Computer processors got a lot faster. So Moore's law is this idea that every couple of years, the speed of computing can double and double and double. And it's held true pretty much until now. There's controversy as to whether it will hold in the future, but it seems to have been something that's held up. So we have more compute, we have more data. And then we took these algorithmic equations that were kind of developed a long time ago, by our standards. So the 1980s, they were talking about this idea of how to do machine learning, but they didn't have the data and they didn't have the compute. So by 2012, all this stuff comes together, and all of a sudden we have this new way of building AI systems, which is called machine learning. So just to kind of set up how that works, essentially you're feeding the machine lots and lots of data, lots and lots of training examples. And sometimes you've got those examples labeled. So you might have a picture of a cat and you say, this is a cat, this is a cat, this is a cat. And a million times later, the machine knows, and I say knows in air quotes, that is a cat. What it really knows is those pixels formed in that kind of display equal something that we say is a cat. So that's essentially how it works in super basic. I'm sure if a data scientist is listening to this, they're like, oh no, there's so much more to it, which there is.
But we want very basic here. We don't want computer scientists explaining it to us, because their level of basic is like way beyond even my ability. So the more simple, the better.
Yeah. So so that's essentially what happens. And we can do that with pictures. We call that computer vision. We can do that with words. We call that natural language processing. And obviously, numbers and things like that. So we can kind of take a lot of data in, and then the machine, based on the pattern matching and the probabilities, it makes some guesses, some best guesses, some estimates.
Okay. So I that's a very relevant, like you bringing up the insurance example is very relevant to disaster risk reduction and emergency management, because a huge part of reducing disaster risk is not building in flood zones or high risk hazard areas. And there's lots of mapping that's going on around flood zones and all of this, but I could see how an AI could there could be a risk of an AI making an incorrect decision about where somebody lives based on the training data that they've gotten, because maybe that hazard no longer exists because some infrastructure has been implemented that the AI doesn't have in its data set. Mm-hmm. So, I mean, for us, I think about Calgary, the Bow is a flood zone. They're creating the Springbank flood infrastructure. I forget what it's called. And so, the AI has the training data that the Bow is a high risk flood area, but they don't know that this mitigation thing is in place. It could still say, no, you're uninsurable. That's a very simple example, but that's kind of, I think, where things can go wrong.
Yeah, absolutely. One of the kind of historical, since we're talking real estate and we're talking where people live, one of the historical examples is this idea of redlining communities. And this is a practice that was especially prevalent in the United States. And so it had traditionally been very difficult because of racist practices for African Americans to buy homes in certain areas. And so in the areas where they did have homes, those areas were kind of redlined by real estate professionals and kind of downgraded in terms of the market value. Again, sort of having adverse impacts on a community and discriminating against a community in terms of the value of their home, which is arguably, our largest asset. And so kind of taking this into a disaster, maybe making a connection here, we can think about what happened in 2005 with Hurricane Katrina in New Orleans, and certain communities that didn't get the resources that they needed. Predominantly what we saw is a lot of those were vulnerable communities of color that didn't necessarily get the assistance. And again, they were kind of grouped in inner city neighborhoods, maybe where the infrastructure wasn't as developed or wasn't well kept up. And so we can connect how historical practices of where people were basically kind of made to live in a certain area, and then those areas didn't get infrastructure upgrades, and then a disaster happens, and all of a sudden that community is adversely impacted to, to a greater degree, let's say, or didn't have as many options to leave. So just to kind of like connect these ideas into how that happens. And now there isn't any AI involved in that scenario, but
No.
just imagine about, when you start bringing in, if you used all that data and you started making inferences and predictions that could be inaccurate and maybe would continue to perpetuate and amplify a bias. That's how these things can work.
Yeah, and that's one point I want to make sure we kind of get across to everybody, that AI just really makes a prediction, right? I think that's a fairly important word when you're talking about AI. Is that fair?
Yes, I mean it can be used to make prediction, and I guess what I would say is yes, that's fair on the one hand, because I think people want that. We want
Yeah.
this we want the crystal ball, right? Like this is sort of
Yeah.
where AI is being held out as the crystal ball. However, I guess my caution is that always appropriate to use AI in that way as a predictive machine, or should we use it more like a mirror? Because it can also be a
Mm,
reflection. It can also be, hey, here's how things have been. And if we don't like that reflection, maybe we do something different. And probably the best example of that is climate change models. So we're using all of this data to make predictions about where things are going with climate change. And some of those things, we don't like those predictions. Those are really, really bad things unless we make some changes, which we're trying to make societally, so that we can have like different models and have different
okay.
outcomes. So we're kind of like putting in place the interventions so that we don't necessarily get to that prediction, if that makes sense.
Okay. I like that mirror analogy. And I think it plays into the idea that, we do have control over our future, and that AI can support us in being able to shape that future. Um,
Absolutely. I think it's
yeah.
a really important message, and that's a really important thing to note, is that we as humans, we're developing the systems, so we need to take care when we're doing that. That's one of the things I talk to people who build AI about, is taking care in their work and making sure they're using, good quality ingredients. Let's say if you're going to be making
Mm,
a meal, you want to use good quality ingredients. Similarly, with an AI system, you want to make sure you're using good quality ingredients. But also, because we get to make choices about the future that we want, we get to decide where we want to go in this future. So it's not this fatalistic sense of, well, we're helpless and we can do nothing. That's not it at all. We actually need to take an active role in deciding the future that we want and making the appropriate policies and societal choices and using technology in the appropriate ways to get us there.
okay. That's awesome. I love that. So I'm going to kind of put myself in the shoes of an emergency manager or a disaster risk reduction practitioner. Maybe, I'm either working in a small community or a large urban community. Maybe I'm with a not-for-profit. Maybe I'm an emergency manager responsible for a post-secondary or a hospital, and so some of those different communities, even in the government, they're all involved in creating policy. Like they have some role to play in creating policy for their program. And I want to get into this idea of, like we spoke off air, cultural readiness and data governance. Which one to you is kind of the starting point when, if an organization is thinking about, okay, we want to just, like, we don't want an AI solution necessarily, but we'd like to spend the next 5 years strategically looking at AI and how we can incorporate it in our emergency management program or community. Like, should we start with cultural readiness, data governance? Where's a good place to start?
Yeah, I think cultural readiness is really important. First of all, I want to echo what you just said about taking your time with this, because I think that there can be technological FOMO, I'll call it, this kind of fear of missing out. If I don't get on the
Yeah.
bandwagon right now, I'm going to miss out. And that's really not the case. And I think that sometimes, the hype around a technology can be really overwhelming for organizations. I do think AI is an important technology and a useful technology, but don't feel like you've missed the boat if you're not, already implementing it. So that's one thing. So I think that, when I talk to organizations who are building AI solutions, the best place to start is with your business problem. So what are you trying to achieve? What are your business goals? And really, really understanding those in the context of data and how data might be useful. And I think what tends to happen with organizations is they think AI is going to come in and be this magic thing that just they turn on and it tells them all the answers. And that's never the case. So I think having appropriate expectations about what AI is going to be able to do, and do you have the right data and policies and practices in place to even really understand what's at your disposal and what you need to answer your business questions. So again, it's about connecting your business question to data and having appropriate expectations about how this technology is going to inform decision making, not take over necessarily, but inform the decision making process, and kind of lining up all the ducks for that to happen. I think it's not, what I don't recommend is hire a data scientist, put them in the room somewhere and hope they're going to develop some AI solutions.
Hmm.
Please don't do that. That is a recipe for disaster.
Yeah, you can't, yeah, 100%, because the data scientist isn't there to dream up the problems of the organization and then fix it. They come in like way down the process after, all of this sort of front end strategic stuff has been done. Um, or they, I'd imagine too, you can bring them in like someone like you to kind of provide that upfront consultation to kind of get them set for when they're ready to actually start a build. But what does cultural readiness mean in in kind of like a data governance world? Like if I was a small community, small organization, we've already got a culture. What needs to be enhanced about our existing culture to be ready for AI?
Mhm. Yeah, I mean, I think about things like understanding how you're using data today to make decisions. First of all, are you using data? I think that there is, we like to hear, oh, we're data driven. But when it comes right down to it, sometimes organizations aren't as data driven as they think they are. And so I think just kind of assessing like what kind of data are you using and accessing? Is it coming in the form of reports and dashboards? Is it all internal data? Are you using external data sources as well? Just kind of mapping out exactly what that looks like. I think that's part of this cultural readiness. Having leadership in place that's willing to get behind, just like any good project management process will say, you need to have that executive level sponsor. So AI readiness, again, I think needs that executive level sponsorship as well to say like we are going to get behind this and we understand that it's not going to be a one and done process where we just implement an AI enabled solution and then we kind of step back and that's that. AI requires a constant commitment and monitoring and resources and a team to manage that. So are we committed culturally? Is this part of our strategic direction? How does that inform where we're going as an organization? So just kind of having that level of readiness as well. And then the other thing, from an ethics perspective, I like to, make sure that we have a range of technical and non-technical stakeholders who are trained in the basics of understanding what is AI, what are its limitations, what is its usefulness, and how might we put in place a thoughtful set of policies and system in our organization to make sure we keep AI on the rails, so to speak. And that to me is part of the cultural readiness is this training as well.
Okay, that is awesome. So I'm correct me if I'm inaccurate or wrong here, but here's what I kind of comes up for me as you're talking. And because I imagine there's going to be people listening or watching this, listening to this or watching this saying, "Oh my gosh, like I can barely even get my emergency management program well funded, well resourced, my executive committing to it. I can barely get our leadership committed to our program. How could I even start to take on AI and all of this?" But I think this is kind of like what it might have been like for an organization back in like the late 80s, early 90s, when they were starting to look at computers. Like, how do we bring in desktops, Macs or PCs into the workplace? Um, that there was a cultural readiness that had to go then. I mean, you had Microsoft pushing it and Apple pushing it and kind of helping organizations become cultural ready. I don't think that level of support is there for AI yet, but I think it's coming. So I think for organizations to think about this, it's kind of like, you know, what did you do? What are you doing now to bring in new technologies? Because this is
Hmm.
just a new technology. So I remember back in the government, 20 it was during 2013 floods. We brought in iPads for damage assessment. iPads were not they were just starting to be used in government by different departments. We went out to Best Buy and like literally bought 50 or 60 iPads for damage assessment. That took like we were not culturally ready for it, but because of this event, it drove us there. And so I think for organizations, maybe spending time looking back to kind of how have you committed to other technology upgrades can help inform how you could do it for AI.
Yeah, I think absolutely what you said is so true. And so I mentioned working at CKUA. So CKUA is coming up on 100 years old. So you can
Yeah.
imagine the technological changes. I always used to take people through and show them the evolution of radio from, the early 1900s to today. And you've
Well,
just
that's where the
mentioned.
alerts used to come from,
Yes, exactly. And
right?
we were part of that whole, emergency management alerting system through
Yeah.
broadcasting, but now we get alerts on our smartphones. And so you look at the evolution of anything. Back in the 80s, who had an IT department? Probably nobody. Who doesn't have an IT department today? Probably
Yeah.
nobody. So
Yeah.
I think it's really interesting when you think about the ways in which technologies, again, this is sort of this idea of a socio-technical system. Technologies come in and they reshape things, and we reshape our organizations and ourselves around technologies as well. Social media is another more recent example. Who's not doing some level of social media at an organization, even a very small organization? You have somebody who's staying on top of those things because it's a necessary place to participate now. And so I think AI is going to be in this realm as well. And how that reconfigures or restructures organizations and how they spend resources, I think is going to be interesting. One of the things that I think, this is just my own prediction, we'll see how
Yeah.
this actually plays out, but I think many organizations are going to encounter AI, not necessarily because they build it in house themselves, but because it comes with a technology that they're purchasing. And so AI, it's already in a lot of these, software programs, just to a certain degree. But I think more and more of it will come through the supply chain, and we'll encounter it that way than a pure build it from scratch. Just like no one builds their own general ledger accounting system anymore. But back in the 70s, they actually did. And so I think AI is going to go through this similar kind of pathway.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, in futures thinking, looking back to look forward is a process used to kind of help organizations understand that the big task ahead isn't really anything that different than we've already evolved through. So let's settle our horses a little bit. Let's go from, like you said, the FOMO to this could be for some organizations like a 10-year journey, but it starts with working with someone like you to make sure that from the very start, because we all know when you're with data, if you don't decide on what data to capture and in what way at the start, and you go through the process, like it can be very expensive because you could be capturing the wrong thing, and you've got to go back to the beginning and all of this. So starting it off in the right way at a slower pace is really important. Yeah.
Absolutely, absolutely. And just, I always have this need to kind of not oversell myself. My specialization is really the ethics side of things.
Right.
And so what I'm really good at is helping you think through, if we do this, what might be the potential ramifications of doing that, and then thinking through how we put in place the safeguards to prevent that from happening. So planning strategically from an ethics perspective, I of course wouldn't be the person that you bring in to assess your data per se, but I can help assess your organizational readiness from an ethics standpoint more so. So
Yeah.
just to kind of be clear on what I do versus what someone else with more of that data science or STEM background might do.
Sure. And so you're able to come in and work with policymakers, I would imagine. Like, who in an organization do you work with the most or often?
Yeah, I mean, ideally, it sort of depends on the size of the organization,
Right.
but ideally, you want to make sure you're working with senior individuals in an organization who are going to be able to kind of set the tone, let's say. Tone at the top is something that we talk about a lot in AI ethics. So making sure that's really clear in terms of, from an ethics standpoint, what are we as a company going to do or not going to do? Those are really important considerations that link back to our values, our mission, our vision, how we want to show up in the world as an organization. And generally, those are set by, if not board members, senior leadership for sure. And sometimes in some larger companies, they might also have a group that is, let's call them the ethics owners. A lot of times they look like the compliance and regulatory group, but they might also
Mm.
be responsible for ethics as well. So working with those individuals. And then through training, because I think that you can't be successful by just having things remain at the top, you need to make sure all of this permeates your whole organization. And that's where the role of something like training, and that could be workshops or that could be online asynchronous training, can come in to give everybody who's involved in that project the basics of what they need to understand AI and ethics in the case of what I do. So that's really the groups that I would work with. It can start at the top, but then I do like to kind of move into the people who are actually doing the work.
Okay. And so it's kind of like through your work, when you're working with an organization, there is a point where you've got to bring together I don't want to, like, a working group or like a committee or like different people that are from different departments that can kind of provide the whole picture as you're going through this, because it's going to permeate throughout the whole organization.
Absolutely. And it's
Okay.
really, really important to have different perspectives. One of the things that we talk a lot about in ethics work is diverse multi stakeholder feedback. And so in an organization, you can bring different perspectives together through having people from different departments, different backgrounds, different skill sets. But also part of the process is looking at who the system is going to impact. So in the case of emergency response, you have a large group of people, i.e., the citizens of your municipality or your province or whoever you're responsible for. And so making sure you're taking that perspective as well. And if necessary, doing focus groups, doing public consultation, getting the feedback that you would need from those particular groups, I think is an important part of the process too. So there's kind of the internal piece, but then there can be the external piece as well.
Okay. And I didn't want to go there. We go. Okay. So so then we get it. So there's the cultural readiness piece. Part of that is the training. Then part of that is getting into, you kind of mentioned earlier, that governance piece. So, who at the top is going to sort of, or how is the organization going to govern the data they collect, what data comes in, how they do it, and how it's used. That's kind of another big piece to this, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And the good news about that is there is a lot of guidance around data governance. So data governance is not a new phenomenon. What might be new about it is the big data component of it, and then marrying that with AI. But good data governance practices, DAMA is an organization that has literally written the book. And I have it here. It's like a 600-page
Oh,
tome of how to do data governance well. And so there should be good data governance practices in place. And there's lots of examples of how to do that well. So if you're not doing that yet, I would say that is a starting point for you as an organization, is to take those data governance principles that have been around for, again, 20, 25 years or so, and make sure that you have implemented those.
good. And okay, so on that point, I want to make sure I ask you this because I want to know what it's like. But let's put a pin in the. I noticed you just took training around the First Nations information governance.
Mhm.
I think on LinkedIn I saw you have a post. So I want to
Yeah,
come back to that because I want to ask you about that training.
sure.
But for anybody watching, we have not even talked about development of AI yet. Like, we're still at, what's the business problem? Is the culture ready? Is the organization ready to commit to AI technology? And what does data governance look like? So, like, thinking about this whole process, like, we haven't even started talking about, hey, let's come in and start actually talking about a design of a
Hmm.
technology. So
Yeah.
there's I think that just shows how much there is to AI that we don't hear about in all the social media and all the news and everything. Like, we just see the technology, or we see the product or service, and then we hear about how it's going to take over the world and humans are going to never exist. But that's far out there. But yeah.
Yes, absolutely. And just to kind of give you a small personal example of this. So last year, I was doing a little bit of feasibility work for my business. And the business problem I wanted to solve or start solving is this idea of how do we make sure that we're not creating bias when we're hiring people. So I wanted an algorithm that was going to help us ensure that we weren't exhibiting bias in the hiring process. And I had enough money to do a very, very small experiment using some open source tool sets and so forth. And what I learned through that process, and I'd hired a professor at the U of A to kind of be my lead AI person, and we hired some students to help work on this. And what I learned from that process is A, how hard it was to find the right data set for that
Mm.
experiment, and B, how we couldn't really do anything else until we found the data set that we were going to use. So when we think about the role of data, it really kind of drives a lot of this decision making. It's not like you come in and say necessarily, well, I want to do XYZ design. Perhaps if you had unlimited budgets and unlimited access to things, maybe that's the way you do it. But a lot of times you're really kind of looking at the interplay of the data that you have and what you want to do, and then that kind of like leads you down a path of how you're going to do things. So that was my own personal experience in seeing that play out.
Yeah, no, that's a great story. And I think that's really what is going to make this relatable for people who are working in organizations where, that cultural readiness does not exist. So they're not even really talking about it at the most senior levels. And that's kind of where I want to focus on, because the big corporations, the multi-million dollar corporations, they've got the resources. They are already investing in this technology. They've been investing in it for a while now. They're way ahead. So how can the smaller organizations, the smaller businesses, the smaller communities sort of be ready for AI if it's the appropriate technology for their problems? That's
Mhm.
the other big thing, right? Is identifying that problem and then identifying if AI is even the right solution, because it may not be the right solution for the problem.
Yeah, no, it's those are great questions. So I'm thinking back, I'm thinking about your comment about looking back to go forward. And I'm thinking about things, every technology kind of goes through this pathway where in the beginning it's super expensive, it's super inaccessible. Think about the internet. So
Mm,
back in, I don't know, it's when did the internet start? The 60s or the 50s. This is like this
yeah.
tiny group of researchers in the military, and they had access, and nobody else even knew what this thing was. And then by kind of the early 90s, we start to see it in educational institutions, but it's only on the one computer that's over there, and you have to book a special time to use it. And now we all just carry devices around in our pocket. And in fact, when we're not connected, that's kind of weird. Like we're always connected to something, right? And so
Yeah.
we've seen this trajectory of a technology kind of infuse a society and become cheaper in the process. And I think we're going to see similar trajectories with AI, where right now it's the purview of very big corporations with teams of data scientists and lots of compute power. But as things kind of evolve, we're probably again going to access it through our own supply chains, and it's going to become part of our business. So I think things are going to go through that evolution. So the question is, how do you prepare for that, or how do you get ready for that? There's lots of information online, so much information online. So I think curiosity is a wonderful quality to
Mm,
have when you're running an organization. And so I think getting out there and just learning some of the basics. Again, there's lots of videos or talks that you can listen to, podcasts and like this one, where you can just listen to people talk about how this might be relevant to your particular sector. So that's one thing, just kind of basic education. And then two, as with everything else, start with a small experiment of some sort. So
yeah.
yeah, you might be able to take a very small kind of area and say, okay, if we understand what this technology can do, we understand our business. Now let's look at the intersection here, and what's a small experiment that we might be able to run to just test things and see how it goes. And so that's another thing that you can do is sort of don't feel like you need to kind of come in and change everything tomorrow. I think we can take an approach where it's a little bit more measured and have a fence around it, so to speak.
Yeah, that's a great comment, because um I went through the Propel program with Startup Edmonton, now Innovate Edmonton, and I met a gentleman there who owns a company called Browse AI, and so I kind of met with him a couple times, because I was just like, can AI do this? Could AI do that? Could AI do this? And he's like, well, I don't know, but what you could do is he suggested I could hire like a virtual assistant to do some prototyping. So what is the data I want to collect? Could that, if the virtual assistant could go out and collect it and collate it, then you could use that as a model to potentially develop a theory on whether an AI could do it. And it's a relatively very inexpensive way to kind of develop that prototype. So I kind of think that's what you're leading into, is that you can create these sort of minimum viable AI products very inexpensively, and then make some decisions after that.
Yeah, absolutely. And from an ethics standpoint too, I would also say don't go out and rush to apply it in your most high stakes situation either.
Right.
Maybe you want to test something a little bit lower stakes. And so thinking about that too is I know there's a lot of rush to use AI and all kinds of what I would consider high stakes scenarios. But I don't necessarily think that should be the starting place for these technologies. I think we need to run experiments in what I might consider a little bit more contained and safer ways, and see how they're going, and put in place appropriate processes and guardrails and manage that, and then figure out from there where you want to go.
Yeah, and so with yeah, no, that's good, because again, like I said earlier, the point of this is really to sort of, reduce that anxiety that exists around that FOMO, and just, letting people know that it's okay to not be engaged with AI technology at this point, that, and if you want to be engaged, you don't have to like rush in and spend a ton of money. There's lots of ways you can do it. What is something around ethics and ethics related to AI that you want people to really sort of take in and think about?
Mhm. The biggest thing that I think about are power dynamics. So if you think about where we see a lot of ethical issues is when there is an imbalance of power of some sort. So power dynamics can happen between employees and employers. They can happen between a government and its citizenry. They can happen between large corporations that hold a lot of power and, and us, the users of, social media tools and other tools, let's say. So anywhere where you have a power dynamic imbalance, you can have a potential for an ethical issue. And so ethical issues tend to stem from something that's unfair or unjust, something that's discriminating against a group, something that's infringing on someone's autonomy or their ability to make good decisions about themselves, or something that's creating a harm or some kind of adverse consequences. And the more those things happen in realms that are really, really important to people, like getting access to a resource, access to, say, finances or education or healthcare, decisions that are made in, say, the context of a criminal justice system, again, huge inequalities and power dynamics at play there, the bigger potential you have for an ethical issue. So I'm just trying to paint the picture of where, ethics lives and why it's so important to really examine a power dynamic when you're thinking about how you're going to use an AI technology.
Yeah, and that's great because there is so there like right now, I think with the protests that went on in Ottawa around the vaccination and like we're just seeing this surge in power dynamics between the wealthy, lower income, middle income, different political parties. So I wonder, like, in emergency management, there's a huge power gap between women in emergency management and men in emergency management because it's a very male dominated, white male dominated field, mostly because a lot of emergency managers end up coming out of fire services, military, very white male dominated sectors as well. And I talked to like quite a few women who have power struggles with their leaderships, fire chiefs, directors of emergency management in their community. And I think a big part of that is, in emergency management, there isn't like well-defined ethics that I know of. I mean, there's a lot of people doing research in ethics and disaster justice. So I guess I'm just wondering, what is the opportunity there maybe to use the conversation of ethics for AI to also unravel the ethics within disaster justice or social justice? Is there room for that in this conversation? It probably is, eh?
I think so. I'm a hopeful person. I'm going to say
Yeah,
yes, there is. And
good.
so a couple thoughts as you're describing the world of disaster management. It's very much like the world of AI. So you've just described, AI to a certain degree in terms of who builds AI today. Well, mostly men, because most of the computer scientists are still predominantly male. In AI, I've heard statistics of anywhere from 13 to 20% female. So very, very low numbers in terms of the amount of women that are involved in building this technology. And then in terms of the diversity, it's primarily white and Asian men. I saw some statistics about Google's workforce. This is a couple of years ago, but it was only about 2% Black. So, and very few Indigenous people, for example. So it's, again, a very homogenous group of people. They're from a certain socioeconomic background. So I think that it's important to A, call those things out and understand them. And B, if we look at AI as a tool, how might we use AI to shift power in those relationships? I don't know enough about your world to really give a commentary specifically on how to do that. But I think that could be a question that could be raised if we decide that, yes, we want more diversity and we want more voices around the table so that we can do a better job of our work in emergency preparedness. How can AI play a role in that, perhaps? And I don't know the answers, and I don't even know
No.
if it's necessarily appropriate, but it would be a question that I would put on the table for discussion, and those who are in that space would be able to shed light on that.
Yeah, and I'll have to because it kind of, as you were talking, I'm like, you know, yeah, how would an AI, like an AI, I don't think, unless it had the data, could not recognize someone who's transgender. Like it would be very difficult for the AI. Like it could possibly do male female, but it's not going to have a very easy time recognizing as someone transgender, agender, which kind of gets into that realm of now you're placing people in a binary silos. AI is not helping kind of the whole gender spectrum or neurodiverse spectrum. This person's autistic, this person is not, or where are they? Like it's still very it's still a technology that's kind of driven by the data, still fairly binary in some respect when it comes to people, and that's why I think the ethics part is really critical.
Yeah, absolutely. And so maybe that's not where you want to apply it. Maybe it's more in an analysis of environmental factors or some other area. And
Yeah,
I'm not saying those don't come without without their own ethical considerations that need to be
yeah,
taken into account. But for example, perhaps making predictions about people isn't. I mean, I still feel in general the riskiest area is making predictions about people, especially trying to make predictions about diverse groups of people where you're making what's known as a proxy or an inference. So you might have a data point, but you don't really know the next data point. So you're kind of inferring the next thing and the next thing. And pretty soon you're out on a limb making some pretty bad inferences about people that have the potential to be wrong and also have the potential to cause harm to that person, which is not what
yeah.
we want.
And you could be making worse inferences with that technology than if you did on your own.
For sure, because it amplifies
It
everything.
amplifies everything.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. So I'm going to go to your website really quick, but tell us a little bit about the training you took for the First Nations information and governance. Um, just dive into that a little bit about how was it? What were some of the things that really stood out to you from that training? Because I think that is I love that strategic framework. I've gone through it. It is like so important, I think.
Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. So one of the things that I felt was really important when I was doing my own courses, writing my own courses in AI ethics, I really felt it was important to highlight who else is doing work in this area and in particular diverse communities. And one of the groups I came across was the First Nations Information Governance Center. And they have this OCAP course, which stands for Ownership, Control, Access, and Possession of Data. And it looked like a fantastic course. And I thought, I must take this course. And so I signed up and I completed it last month. And it was a wonderful course. I learned a lot about the history of why First Nations communities are engaging in this way or have created this framework to manage their own data and take control of managing their data. And it's something that I think could provide a really interesting way forward or model for us, for kind of the non-First Nations communities as well. We've talked a lot in circles that I've been in about this idea of a data trust, where we have people who are kind of looking out for us and helping us manage our data and have a fiduciary responsibility to us. Because it's gotten so complicated. It's so hard to manage your data. It goes in so many different directions. And so I think this OCAP model presents a really interesting set of possibilities to learn from. So that was one thing that I thought about. And then the other thing that really struck me about this particular course is that how much our own cultural biases influence the way we think. And I'm part of this culture and I'm subject to these biases as well. And one of those biases is the idea of everything driving from the individual. So in our Western culture, kind of the autonomous unit is that of me, the individual person. But in other cultures, it might not be that. It might be a collective, it might be a community level. And that's something that I really got out of this course is the ways in which the community is looking out for the community, not just and all the individuals, of course, in the community, but thinking about it differently and framing it from the level of community. I thought was really interesting. And again, something that I think we can learn from as we're grappling with all these collective big problems in the world. I think we need to come together in community to solve them.
Yeah, and especially with indigenous communities, like, a lot of their data is stored in stories, and a lot of their knowledge is stored in nature. And that that has so much value. Um, as settlers, as people that kind of develop colonial ways of working, we have always uh, taken from indigenous communities without giving much back, or if anything at all. And so I think this framework really helps people understand that, you know, understanding, what even, what in nature can act as a First Nation medicine, or even the stories that they tell. It's their data, it's their information, it's their knowledge. Taking that and putting it out there and using it and commercializing it requires a lot of pre-work to make sure that you can do it, that you compensate the community or the First Nation or whomever you got that data and information from. You compensate them, you recognize them, you make sure that whatever comes about from you using their data somehow gets back to the community. And I think that's kind of what this framework helps with as well. Is that fair to say?
Yes, and again, kind of going back to that whole issue of power dynamics,
Yeah.
it really starts to level set instead of having an extractive relationship. And this happened a lot in research too. This is why OCAP was actually set up. It was because of bad healthcare research that was taking place in communities, and the community recognizing that these researchers were there to be extractive and just take things like data and then go off and do whatever they wanted with it. And so the community said, let's try and rebalance that power structure. And that's really where these principles
Okay.
lie. And so I think that's a really important lesson that, again, we can look at this and go, is this how we actually still want to go ahead and do business as non-First Nations or settler communities, or can we learn something here about how things get restructured, and maybe we can restructure some things too? And again, I think these data trusts are a really interesting way of thinking about that. We're still super early days on that kind of thing, but I think it's an
Yeah.
interesting idea.
Yeah. And how can indigenous communities and organizations use AI to take back power?
Mhm.
I think that would be a super cool conversation. So I want to show your website here, because you talked about training, and I know you've got the micro credential through Athabasca University. Is that micro credential like a great place for someone to start their AI journey, or is it down the road a bit? Where does that land on kind of the learning spectrum?
I think it's a great place. I can tell you, when we conceived of this micro credential, we really wanted to make it accessible to people who don't have a background in technology and don't have a background in AI, just like I didn't have any background in this area when I first started out. And so we wanted to make sure that we gave everyone the basics of what is AI, what is machine learning, how does it work, and then also the basics of the ethical considerations and drive from there. So we assume no prior knowledge in AI or in ethics. The credential is 4 courses. So we start out with an introduction to AI ethics, and then we go into a deep dive on data in course 2. Machine learning models is course 3. And then the last course, which isn't quite live yet. It'll go live sometime in June, is on robo-ethics. And we haven't talked
Ooh,
as much about robots, but when you bring AI into a being that then can move around with you and have physicality about it, it raises some other interesting ethical questions. And so we wanted to
yeah.
address those as well. So that's the whole certification, is those 4 courses.
I like that one because I have a huge issue because I'm always telling my kids, like, you can't yell at Siri, you can't yell at, like, you can't treat this technology in a disrespectful way. Sure, it doesn't have feelings and it's whatever, but if we're treating robots and AI technologies that you can converse with, avatars like that, then that's not progressing humanity in a respectful way. So I love the fact that you're going into robo ethics, where I imagine some of that treatment of robots and cyborgs needs to be discussed.
Absolutely, absolutely, and you're so right, Brad, in that it really is about your own humanity and having respect for things. It sort of extends out into how you're going to treat other people, and that becomes especially important too when we start to make robots that look like humans, so
Yeah,
humanoids. Which are a thing, and so we don't, again, kind of going back to not wanting to discriminate or stereotype people, but if we start feeling like we can treat things disrespectfully, it does spill over into how we treat each other.
yeah.
Absolutely.
Well, look at Japan. I mean, Japan's whole robot industry is based on the idea that they are aging and elderly people in Japan are going to need help. And it's not going to come from the younger generation, it's going to come from robots.
Yeah, absolutely. And Japan is an interesting case because it's of the Shinto religion and the this idea that there's reverence for non-human objects is already in place. And so, as we're talking about how we treat things, there's a cultural dynamic there too in Japan that's already well established in
Yeah.
terms of how they think about and treat inanimate objects. That's already there because of that Shinto religion.
Yeah, that's really cool. So you got nominated for award, I see.
I did, yes.
Holy, congratulations.
Thank you so
North
much.
America.
I didn't win an award, but I was nominated, and it
Still.
was an amazing, it was a wonderful event with so many women who are doing fantastic work in AI across North America. It was really inspiring just to hear their stories and the kinds of things that they're doing, not just in AI ethics, but in AI overall. And it kind of goes back to my point about diversity and inclusion, like the need to have more people from all walks of life, and women especially, like building these technologies and thinking about new ways in which they might be useful.
Yeah, yeah, congratulations. That, I mean, because you started your AI journey, what, like you said 4 or 5 years ago, started
Hmm.
your company a year ago,
Yeah.
and you're already getting this type of recognition, which is, I think, speaks volumes to, you know what, I love how you use pioneer. I don't know if you've ever, if you're a big Yellowstone TV show fan.
I've
Um,
watched it, yes.
or they did like the 1883 kind of the pre to, and they're pioneers, and in the sense of traveling across North America in the wagons, and not a great story for First Nations and Indigenous communities. I won't get into that part, but like, I've got a letter from a family member who uh, took wagons. I think they ended up in Westlock. I can't remember where they came from, but in like that time, 1880s. That's what it was like to be a pioneer 140 years ago. You are pioneering in the technology world in 2022. Just, it's risky. There's not a lot of payoff yet. Things are always changing, and you can go into a lot of different directions. You're really putting yourself out there, especially in the ethics portion. Um, So like, yeah, great. That I love how you use pioneer in that sense, and now you're being recognized for it. So that's really just my point.
Thank you.
Congratulations.
Thank you.
Um, all right. So yeah, we were just on ethicallyalignedai.com. That's your website. What I don't know. We're gonna talk again, but what did we miss from this conversation that you think needs to be said?
Wow. I mean, there's always so much more that can be said. I think we've covered a lot of things. We've done a great overview of many, many topics. Obviously, we can go on and on. I think that, maybe for some follow-up conversation, maybe talking a bit more about data. I like to talk about data, where it came from, why does data exist? We all, when I do talks about data, I talk about the politics of data and the
Mm,
politics of counting. And I think we've seen some interesting politics around that in the last couple of years in terms of counting, say, COVID numbers. And so there's a lot more to be said about data and where it comes from, why it exists. And also there's the data that we don't have and why don't we have that data? And what are the power dynamics involved with that? So there's things I think we could get into around data that I think would be interesting for your audience, a future
yeah.
conversation.
No, absolutely. And the goal of this again was just to introduce emergency managers, disaster risk practitioners into AI, and just again creating that sense that there is not a lot of urgency around this. I mean, there is urgency in the sense that if you think AI is going to be a big part of your organization or your career or your work in the future, start learning now. You don't need to invest. Like you were saying, there's podcasts, there's YouTubes, there's this. You don't need to invest a lot in it right now, and you can gently transition into uh, that cultural readiness piece and big thing. So we will have you back again for sure to talk about data. I want to personally follow up with you and pick your brain about some of the stuff we talked today, because I think that there's opportunity to kind of get some more resources out there, get some more knowledge out there for people that are hungry for it. And so we'll talk about that, I think, going on in the future. But I really appreciate your time today and you coming on here.
Well, thanks so much. It's been a lot of fun. I always learn so much when I have these conversations with people, and it's really fascinating just to learn about your world of emergency management and emergency preparedness. Such a necessary profession and domain right now, as we're seeing all kinds of potential with climate change and with other things that are happening in our world. So I'm happy to be here.
Yeah, awesome. All right. Well, thanks everyone for watching this. As always, stay connected and visit ethicallyalignedai.com to learn more about Katrina and the work that her and her team are doing. And we will be in touch and make sure you always stay connected. Thank you very much.